Hi friends, have you ever thought about the origin of life? Does life on earth originated from mud? Today, we are going to discuss about the spontaneous generation theory. Welcome to Fahim's science session. Modern day biologists now understand how organisms arise from pre-existing organisms through cell division, asexual reproduction, and sexual reproduction. This is one of the foundational claims of cell theory that all cells come from other cells. This also supports germ theory, the idea that diseases arise from transferring and replicating microbes and pathogens. However, it has been thought in the past that life can arise and randomly emerge out of non-living matter if certain conditions or ingredients are met. For example, maggots were thought to generate themselves out of rotting meat, and worms were thought to emerge from the combination of soil and water. It's now common sense that maggots emerge from the eggs laid by parent flies and that worms lay eggs underground that come to the surface when it rains. Though this information seems obvious now, it was common in the past to believe that living organisms can arise from places other than eggs, seeds, and reproduction. This cluster of failed hypotheses makes up the obsolete theory known as spontaneous generation. From the time of the ancient Romans through the Middle Ages and until the late 19th century, it was generally accepted that some life forms arose spontaneously from non-living matter. Such spontaneous generation appeared to occur primarily in decaying matter. For example, a 17th century recipe for the spontaneous production of mice required placing sweaty underwear and husked wheat in an open-mouthed jar, then waiting for about 21 days, during which time it was alleged that the sweat from the underwear would penetrate the husk of wheat, changing them into mice. Although such a concept may seem laughable today, it is consistent with the other widely held cultural and religious beliefs of the time. The first serious attack on the idea of spontaneous generation was made in 1668 by Francesco Redi, an Italian physician and poet. At that time, it was widely held that maggots arose spontaneously in rotting meat. In these experiments, he demonstrated that maggots arise from the eggs of flies rather than directly from rotting meat. He did so by taking several jars and placing raw meat inside of them. Half the jars he left open to the environment and the other half he covered with gauze. Several days later, the open jars had maggots in the meat, while the jars that were covered, making it impossible for flies to lay their eggs inside, had none. Additionally, he noted that there were maggots on the outside of the gauze on the covered jars. He was thus able to show that the rotting meat did not generate the maggots. In England, John Needham challenged Redi's findings by conducting an experiment in which he placed a broth or gravy into a bottle, heated the bottle to kill anything inside, and then sealed it. Days later, he reported the presence of life in the broth and announced that life had been created from non-life. In actuality, he did not heat it long enough to kill all the microbes. An Italian priest, Lazzaro Spallanzani, was not convinced and he suggested that perhaps the microorganisms had entered the broth from the air after the broth was boiled but before it was sealed. To test his theory, he modified Needham's experiment. He placed the chicken broth in a flask, sealed the flask, drew off the air to create a partial vacuum, and then boiled the broth. No microorganisms grew. Proponents of spontaneous generation argued that Spallanzani had only proven that spontaneous generation could not occur without air. The theory of spontaneous generation was finally laid to rest in 1859 by the young French chemist Louis Pasteur. Pasteur's winning experiment was a variation of the methods of Needham and Spallanzani. He boiled meat broth in a flask, heated the neck of the flask in a flame until it became pliable, and bent it into the shape of an S. Air could enter the flask, but airborne microorganisms could not. They would settle by gravity in the neck. As Pasteur had expected, no microorganisms grew. When Pasteur tilted the flask so that the broth reached the lowest point in the neck, where any airborne particles would have settled, the broth rapidly became cloudy with life. Pasteur had both refuted the theory of spontaneous generation and convincingly demonstrated that microorganisms are everywhere, even in the air. Though scientists now understand and can directly observe that all cells come from pre-existing cells, it still begs the question, where did the first cells come from? The fossil record shows that the first forms of life on Earth were simple prokaryotic cells that slowly evolved into the diverse species we see today. But where did prokaryotic cells evolve from? Abiogenesis may sound a lot like the failed theory of spontaneous generation, but abiogenesis is merely a possible explanation for the origin of life on Earth. So today's take-home message is microorganisms are present all over. Wash your hands before you eat, whether it is an apple or meat. You need the determination to prevent food contamination. Keep your food covered always. Heat the food to the right degree to make it healthy and germ-free. If you find this video informative, please give a thumbs up and subscribe my channel. Thank you.